So good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on data protection tools for journalists. I am Federico Caruso from OBC Transeuropa, and I speak on behalf of the European Data Journalism Network, which is part of this project on data protection and privacy called Panelfit. Today I'm joined by Iñigo De Miguel, who is a senior researcher at the University of the Basque Country and an expert in data protection. And he will introduce you to some practical tools for journalists that he and together with Lorena Perez Campillo tried to put in a handbook that I linked in the chat. I hope everyone can see it. This is a working version of the handbook, and it will be expanded and amended thanks to the comments and questions that will come from this webinar and the following ones. So please don't be shy and make questions during the presentation or after. We will leave some time for you. So a couple of words on Panelfit. This is a Horizon 2020 project that broadly focuses on the impact of new technologies on our lives and is centered on, in particular, on data protection and privacy. The aim of the project is to give advice to policymakers on the ethical and legal issues that revolve around these topics, as well as providing different groups of people the practical tools to deal with the challenges of this evolving context. So among those groups, we have, of course, journalists that deal with these issues in many ways. Data protection and privacy are both topics that we cover on our stories because of their implications with European policies, human and digital rights, commercial interests, cybersecurity issues, etc. But they are also a matter of professional ethics when we have to choose whether to process or not personal data, to publish or not data on people that are part of a story. So on one side, we have to protect them from being targeted and discriminated because of what we publish. And on the other side, we have to protect ourselves and our organizations from legal infringements due to our processing of personal data. So I hope that the advice that we will give you today will be useful for your day-to-day practice, and of course that the handbook that we will continue to develop until the end of the project, which will be in October this year, will become as well a practical tool for your day-to-day activity. So without any further ado, I will leave you the floor to Iñigo, and please.
Yes, thank you so much, Federico. So I'm Iñigo De Miguel, and I will be the one who will be, sharing this time with you. Hopefully, I will not make this presentation last too long. I will try to introduce you to the basics of the regulation regarding journalism, and then we will have some time for questions and comments. Okay, so I will try to do it as dynamic as possible. I will not lie to you. I will share a presentation, and yeah, I think that there's like 17 slides, some of them with some text, but I will try to, to try to be quite assertive and not to bore you too much with these issues. Well, first of all, let me thank you, Federico, for the introduction. I think he already pointed out the main issues that we are facing today. Just to give you some some ideas about what we are doing. Panelfit, as Federico was mentioning, it's a kind of an EU-funded project that it's aimed at facilitating the implementation of EU data protection regulation. So we're producing a set of outcomes, and one of them is this handbook for journalists that we are introducing to you today. And we are, in general, not only disseminating the data protection regulation, but also trying to improve it. So in that sense, your help will be much appreciated. But for example, and to give you some ideas, we are also working in these days in topics that are really hot topics, such as, for example, the new immunity passports or vaccine certificates or whatever. And we are really working on that and trying to find out whether they work well with the regulation and so on. So if any of you as journalists are working on these topics, we will be glad to answer questions on this. Okay, so once I have done this minimal introduction, let me just get to the point. We will analyze mainly what is usually called the General Data Protection Regulation. That it's a kind of a normative framework, was approved on May 25, 2018. And it's a quite long regulation with like 99 articles. And it also has like 173 recitals that help in the interpretation of the articles. And this regulation is the main tool that we have at the EU level to deal with data protection issues. Of course, these data protection issues are essential in most of the human activities, professional activities right today, because in lots of them there are personal data. I mean, data that have to do with people who are identified or identifiable. You know, and this is the kind of thing that especially journalists should always have in mind while you are doing your work. Okay, so in order to let you understand what this is all about, I think it makes a good sense to understand it through what is usually called the power metaphor, okay, that we all know more or less quite well. The idea is that information is power. So whenever you are processing data, in general, data about someone, you are gaining power over those individuals. So in general, this is undesirable because they're losing power and you're winning back. So in principle, the idea is that we cannot process personal data. This is the main idea. But of course, a general ban would be totally impossible. It would make no sense. So the idea is more or less that the legislature is allowing data processing, but under some conditions. So the idea is that we can only process data for certain kinds of purposes and only under certain conditions on how the processing is implemented. So this is more or less what you need to have in mind. In general, you don't have to process data. And in general, if you are processing some data, it's because you really need them. And you have a very good reason to use those data. And once that you have decided to use those data, you have to make sure that you work well with certain conditions that are essential in the GDPR mindset. So that's what you need to have in mind, okay? So the idea more or less is that you can only process those data if this processing is conducted for legitimate and lawful purposes. To understand what this really means, you should have in mind that legitimate means compliance with the letter of the law. I mean, all the EU laws in general. Lawfulness instead is more or less that you have a legal basis, a reason, a kind of fundamental to justify this processing. So there are some kind of reasons why you could process. For example, there are 6 main legal bases for personal data in general, such as, for example, informed consent, legitimate interest, or I don't know, public interest, vital interest. There are like 6 in general, and we will talk about them later on, especially when they have to do with journalism. And there might be some additional requirements when we are thinking about special categories of data, such as, for example, health data or biometric data, to put some examples, okay? But in general, you have to keep in mind that you can only process data if this is legitimate. The conditions that you have to meet when you will process those data, well, what we usually call the principles and the rights that the general data protection provides to the data subjects. I mean, those people whose data are being processed. Principles are, in general, the main ideas, the key concepts that you should always respect and keep in mind. And I will talk a lot about those principles. Those are, for example, minimization, accountability, limitation of error rates, and so on, purpose limitation. Those are some of the principles. Those principles are usually connected with the rights of the people. In general, people have some rights that apply to those who are processing the data. Okay, but I usually call data responsible data controllers and so on. One of the things that is quite important about the General Data Protection Regulation is that it introduced a kind of power balance through the intervention of what we call supervisory authorities that are based in all member states, meaning that if you, by any chance, process any kind of personal data and the data subject considers that this is not working well with the law, they could always make a claim to the Data Protection Authority, and they could be a very, very restrictive, or they could introduce some kind of very important compulsory measures, such as, for example, fines to avoid that. Okay, so that is more or less what we have. Well, one of the things that is essential is that the GDPR decided that in the case of journalists, it might happen that it will not be a good idea to apply or to introduce a kind of general application of all the articles of the GDPR to your profession, because I guess that you are aware of that, you are somehow essential in democracy. I mean, journalists are the watchdogs of democracy, meaning that we really need to make your work easy. And sometimes it might happen that the GDPR as it is might collide with that. This is why it allows member states to introduce some kind of exceptions to the articles included in the GDPR. But this will only happen if those exceptions are necessary to reconcile the right to the protection of personal data with the freedom of expression and information. And so the point is more or less that when you have to deal with these issues, you have to keep an eye in the GDPR, but another eye on your national regulation, okay? This could be a little bit schizophrenic in so many ways, and probably you will have some problems with your view because it's not so easy to take a look to different parts. But my counsel in general, my advice is that you just make sure of what happens in your national regulation, but most probably it will be quite similar in most of the EU members, okay? And if you understand how the data protection regulation works in general, probably your member state law will be quite, well aligned with the GDPR. And moreover, you should always keep in mind that if there are any exceptional level, they should be quite well justified. They could only apply if they are really necessary to ensure your right, okay? So that's more or less what we have. So to give you some preliminary points, the grounds of this is more or less a kind of solution. So it's at the hands of the member states, and in general, there are some parts that will probably not be so modified at the national level, because those have to do with the jurisprudence of the European Union Court of Justice or the European Court of the Human Rights. So this more or less will be always the same in all member states. If there are any modifications at the national level, that could be in two different ways. And indeed, we have already experienced two different ways of dealing with this kind of national exception. On the one hand, there are some countries that more or less are a little bit more keen on introducing some kind of restrictions on data processing in theory in order to protect data subjects, such as, for example, Bulgaria or Romania. And but at some point, those kind of restrictions don't seem to work too well with what we could call kind of freedom of expression. Moreover, with the need to have journalists as a kind of counterbalance against, the traditional powers. So the idea is that some other countries, I think, that have understood better the message that was in the GDPR. This is the case of Sweden, but also, for example, the case of Austria. And they are just trying to introduce some restrictions in the GDPR that have to do with the idea that journalists really need to have some of the requirements quite relaxed. In our handbook, we have introduced a kind of a table explaining more or less the differences at the national level. But of course, as I was telling you, you will have to take a look to your own countries. But to summarize, there are mostly those tendencies, those ones who are trying to use or introducing a kind of interpretation of the clause that more or less might impede somehow journalism, or at least create some obstacles, and those ones who are thinking more or less just the opposite, that journalism is so important that data subjects' rights could be somehow limited due to the need to have good journalists in their countries. Okay, so that's what we have. And now getting into this kind of the essentials. Well, let's start with what is maybe the most important points. One is that, as I was telling you, in order to process any kind of personal data, you must make sure that you get that this processing is lawful. And data processing is only lawful if a basis of legitimacy allows it. So this means more or less that you need to have a legal basis, as I was telling you. In the case of journalism, usually we think about one of these three main legal bases that might apply to you. One is, of course, consent. I mean, consent has been traditionally the most important legal base for data processing. If the data subject allows you to process their data, well, more or less you can do what you have been authorized to do. This doesn't mean that you could do everything with those data. You should always consider that you need a kind of legal basis for each data processing. For example, if you are publishing something, this doesn't mean necessarily that this consent might also serve for another publication. I don't know, maybe in some other journal or whatever. You must make sure that the consent is for both processing, okay? The consent should also be freely given, specific and informed, meaning that you really need to inform people of what this processing is about, okay? And they need to know about their rights, and they need to know about what you are going to do with those data, how you are going to use them and to storage them, and so many things that you have to tell them according to the General Data Protection Regulation. So consent is a very nice basis, but we all know that it's not the most common one, because there are lots of times when, if you ask a data subject whether they want this data to be published, they will probably tell you, no, never, don't even think about that, okay? So I don't think that informed consent is the most popular base, especially in some kinds of journalism. So you have two other ones that are really, quite well connected between themselves, because those are public interest and legitimate interest. I will start by legitimate interest because it's easier to understand, and somehow it includes public interest. Legitimate interest means that the processing is necessary for legitimate interest, provided that it will not cause unwarranted harm to the person concerned. So the idea is more or less that you have a good reason to process those data. And it might happen that there are some other good reasons why you should not. For example, that the data subject is not willing to have those data published. This doesn't mean that you cannot do that. You only have to do one thing, that is that you should balance the different interests that are at stake. And this is what we call a balancing test. And then you arrive into a conclusion and say, for example, well, I think that all things considered, I should publish this data. This is more or less what the legitimate interest based allows you to do. Okay, you should just have to do this kind of balance test. You should have to record that, you know, and then you could do that. Lots of times, one of the things that will be really definitive in this balancing is whether a public interest is involved. Meaning that if you have a good news or very interesting news, and those are especially important for the public opinion, then you will have an excellent reason to publish that. So in general, you could directly go for the public interest or the public interest on legal base. And I don't think that would be wrong. The only difference is that public interest and legitimate interest do not always coincide, because public interest is a little bit narrower, more narrow in the sense that it might perfectly happen that public interest is one of the reasons why your interest is more important than the data subject's interest, for example, but it will not always happen. It might happen that you want to publish some data, even if they are not of public interest, because of, for example, some other kind of interest that you should have to balance and assess whether they are more important, for example, against the opposition of someone or anything like that. So that's more or less what we have about lawfulness. Then we have another very interesting thing, that is what we call two important principles: purpose limitation and data minimization. Purpose limitation means that whenever you collect or whenever you process personal data, it should be for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes, and not further processed in a manner that it's incompatible with those purposes will happen. So this means that you can, if you collect some data for a purpose, you have to use them for that purpose, and you cannot use them for a different purpose. That's more or less what we have in there. So if by any chance you are thinking about using them for any other purpose, then you will have to find a legal basis that allows you to do so. I will give you an example. Imagine that someone allows you to take a picture, and this is just because they are, I don't know, maybe showing their homes because they're so proud of their homes and the furniture and so on, and you are allowed to process those data for these purposes. But then you make the decision to use these photographs, for example, I don't know, to illustrate another totally different publication about, for example, rich people in your country. It might happen that those people are not happy to be associated with the idea of rich people, and that will be a totally different article with a different perspective. So it might happen that the original content would not cover this kind of processing. So you will need an alternative base for that. Most probably in these cases, in this case, a kind of a new consent to use those photographs for this new purpose, because otherwise you will be, against the purpose limitation principle. Quite similar to that, the data minimization, that is a very interesting principle, means that you can take the information and the data that you need for your work, but you should just use the minimal amount of information that you really need for that. You don't have to gather lots and lots of information and store them for a long time or anything like that. No, data minimization means that you should always, use this kind of minimal amount of data that will let you, work well with what you are trying to communicate to public opinion, but you don't need to use any other additional information. Okay, so that's more or less what we have. Then we have another interesting principle, that is the idea of accuracy. This is essential to journalists, so you must be familiar with that. Accuracy means that the data that you are offering is accurate in the sense that you are not saying nothing that it's false, or nothing that it's not, not exact, not precise. So the idea is that you have to check whether those data work well with reality. And of course, people could tell you to, if this is not the case, and they have a right to rectify, and you are obliged to rectify any information that is not working well with reality. And of course, one of the best ideas, one of the best recommendations that I can give you is that in general, if you are not really publishing a kind of description, but a kind of an opinion, you should try to let the audience know about that. I mean, it's very different when you are just trying to inform than when you are trying to express an opinion. So it's quite important that you let everybody know what this is about. Some years ago, this was very easy to do. I mean, I could, start reading, for example, a newspaper, and I knew what was supposed to be information and what was supposed to be opinion. But in these days, sometimes, it's difficult to trace these boundaries, but this should be clear, in my opinion, okay? It's also, I think, something related to good journalism in so many ways. So next one is something that is called storage limitation. This is also very interesting because journalists are usually, tending to keep all the data that they have, because I mean, you never know if you will need them in the future. So you are continuously storing data and data and data and data. Well, this is not illegal. I mean, data protection regulation does not really ban something like that. I mean, people usually have this misconception. I mean, you can really, storage the data for a long time, but you always need to have a very good reason to do so. And you should always keep in mind that if you keep data, personal data, you will be responsible to whatever happened with this data. So my advice is that you just keep those data that you really need, especially if those are sensitive data. Imagine, for example, that it comes to your hands, something like the kind of a clinical record of someone, and you just need this record for a very concrete story, but you decide to keep it just in case that in the future this might be useful for any other thing, and finally someone is getting access to this clinical record. Well, you will be responsible for whatever happened with that, So my personal advice is that if you don't think that you will need anything, if you have no good reasons, don't keep those data for the just in case reason. That's never a good idea. I mean, I know that you always consider that information is very important, and it is, but never forget that it's not only for you that it is important, okay? So that's more or less what this principle tells you. And then we have the next one that is more or less what we call integrity and confidentiality. So that's more or less that the data that you are using is more or less sensitive material. And indeed, what might happen with that is that you might lose this material, or what could be worse, it could be stolen from you. So the idea is that you should keep some kind of security measure so as to make sure that nobody is getting access to this information. In general, this makes sense, especially if you work in a kind of organization where lots of different people more or less share the same kind of databases. It's very important that you always are able to trace boundaries on who could get access to that information and who should not. And this means that you should introduce some kind of security measures and so on. And of course, you should always keep confidential some kind of information. I mean, if someone is telling you some important information, but it's only giving consent to you to process this information, quite obviously, you should not share it with no one else. But I mean, it's usually what we call good practice in terms of journalists. So just keep in mind these ideas that have to do with the best practices in journalism, and you will have no problems about that. Okay, but in general, you always have to make sure that your security level is adequate to the type of data that you are using, and that you should always justify the way that you have tried to protect your information and why you are sharing this information with someone else. Okay, and never forget, sharing information with someone who is not from your organization, you know, it's a kind of data processing, and you should always have a kind of legal basis to do so. Okay, and then we have, and now I'm finishing almost, what is the idea of accountability? The idea of accountability is very important in the general data protection regulation, because it means that the controller shall be responsible for and be able to demonstrate compliance with paragraph 1. This means more or less that whatever happens with your data, whatever is done with that, it is you that have to demonstrate what happens with that, meaning that you are the controller of those data. I know that in general, individual journalists are not the controller of the data. Maybe you are not aware of that, but if you work for an organization, it's usually the organization you work for that it's considered the controller of those data. If you are not, if you are working on your own, if you're a freelancer or anything like that, quite obviously it will be you, the one who will have to demonstrate compliance. In order to do so, the GDPR imposes a kind of measures that you should take in your organization. Of course, these measures are different if you are a kind of huge, you know, your organization with a lot of employees, of if you're a freelancer or anything like that. But the point is more or less that if you are working in an organization, or if you are the responsible for data in an organization, you should more or less implement kind of organizational measures and policies about data processing and responsibility. And you should always have a kind of records of what has been done during all that time. So more or less, if ever a data protection agency will take a look to your organization, they will just ask you, please give me all your data processing records, because that will be what supposedly will give evidence of what you have done, okay, to work well with the principles included in the general data protection regulation. So more or less is what you will need. So in this, I dare say that especially in huge organization, codes of conduct and some kind of training for journalists are highly recommended. Okay, that's one of the measures that I usually recommend that makes perfect sense, so as that everybody's aware of that. Of course, then also happens that sometimes there are some exceptions in journalism. Might be that, for example, you have a very interesting story. It's not so easy to consider whether you have the time to check it perfectly and so on. And you decide to publish that once you have consulted a veteran journalist or someone who is in the editorial or whatever. You could do that. There should be exceptions to the principles that I'm mentioning. But if you are doing anything like that, this should be carefully reflected in your records. So as if there are any issues, you could always demonstrate that you have tried to do your best to balance this idea of serving the public interest and the idea of protecting human rights, so on. And just to finish, there are some kind of recommendations, for example, that have been included in some documents, for example, the guidelines on software privacy in the media, that more or less tells what are the necessary measures to ensure compliance with data protection requirements and demonstrate this compliance. And here you have, for example, some of these measures that are more or less what I was telling you. For example, it's a good idea to appoint a data protection officer, even if you are not obliged to do that in some circumstances. It's good to have very well described internal procedures, to have a register of data protection processing activities, elaborate a privacy policy, and for example, regular audits to verify and ensure compliance. Just take a look at what people are doing and so on. So there are lots of tools that could work well with this. And I think, Federico, that I will not speak any longer. I think that more or less I have tried to go straight to the points, just to let you know not only what the GDPR says, but more or less what is included in our handbook for journalists. And I hope that you have found this kind of explanation quite useful for you, and at least that I have given you a good notice of what we are dealing with. So if you are missing anything, if you want to ask for anything, we will try to give you some answers. So Federico, hope this helped. I will now give the floor back to you.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Iñigo. It was a very clear overview of the main points of the handbook. So, I guess it was an inviting introduction to delve into the text that also brings some use cases and a lot of useful information that, I mean, sometimes while you were speaking, I was thinking about the lone freelancer who has to deal with these issues without an organization behind him who can protect him and I mean, think about these issues on his behalf. So like if you're in an organization, you just write articles and then confront with colleagues and your boss stuff. But if you're alone, maybe a handbook like this can be even more useful. And I don't know if you agree with this.
Yeah, indeed, totally. I guess it's always the same thing. I mean, huge companies, great organization, always have better life and easier life because they can, for example, afford a kind of lawyers working for them and a DPO that is giving advice and lots of things. Main problem always happens with those freelance journalists, that they don't have such a good access to advice, and sometimes they get lost, and this could be a huge problem. So one of the things we are trying to do with this handbook is just to try to help them, at least to try to impede that they really commit terrible mistakes. There could always be some failures, but sometimes, I mean, most of them are not so important, but at least we should try to avoid the most important ones.
Yeah, that will be a big
help.
Yes, big help. Okay, if there are questions from the audience, please. I think you are free to unmute yourself. Sebastiano, do you want to ask a question, or did you unmute by chance? Sebastiano, we can't hear you.
Okay. I'm not sharing my screen. Oh. Yeah.
Okay. So if anyone wants to speak, now is the time. Otherwise, I'll meanwhile, I'd like to share this this story that I had shared with you, Iñigo, beforehand. I will put the link in the chat. It's a story by the New York Times where these journalists happen to have this leaked data about geo information of people, and they used it to show how this data can be useful to track people. And they actually made an article on that, and also happened to target one of these people who were basically the rioters in the U.S. Capitol in 6th of January. So the ethical and maybe also legal issue is can you use leaked data that shouldn't be available to journalists, just to show the harms that this kind of data can do if used, if misused?
Well, that's a very good question, and in general has to do with the legal basis of processing those data. In general, you need to justify that the public interest of this kind of information will be enough to, to really overwhelm the good reasons why you should not use those data. Is there an answer to that? Probably not. I mean, the main point is that you should. Yeah, you could make a use to that, and the main problem is that I'm hearing someone there. Oh, I'm not sure. Yeah, the main point is that in any way we will try to analyze this case because it's very interesting, and we will try to introduce that in the handbook. Okay. And so for the next version, we will have an opinion about that. But in general, one of the main problems that happen with that is if you have a legal basis to justify this kind of data processing or not. How to know it in advance. We will take a look to the details. I think that Athanasia wanted to intervene.
Yes.
Question?
Yep. There is a question.
Hi.
Yep.
Hi, thank you for this talk. It was very interesting. I'm Athanasia. I'm among other a researcher and also co-founder of an NGO. And I was interested in in the talk because I was wondering about the GDPR implementation to every private citizen in a way. And I explained. So a lot of times the private citizens report events, or they report location and the event, right? And sometimes this information is used for communicating with each other. I was wondering if something I have heard is true, or maybe you can confirm, or you can maybe point me to look better, to the fact that if you share WhatsApp pictures, pictures through WhatsApp of people without their consent, third people, this can be also considered a violation of privacy of data. And I have heard of cases, for example, in France, that people received a fine up to, some thousands of euros about that. So I would like your opinion on your guidance on this. Thank you.
Yeah. In this point, it is quite clear. I mean, the fact that someone is making some kind of information public doesn't mean that you can use that information. This also happens with, for example, with Facebook and the type of photos that someone is just introducing there in Facebook. They're doing that for some kind of purposes. This doesn't mean that you could use those photographs for different purposes. So the idea that the kind of data is made public doesn't mean that you can use this data freely. I mean, you really need to have a legal basis. And the idea that this is public is not really a good legal basis as such.
Yeah, this is very interesting also because sometimes you find some data sets on whatever issue, which is public data, but then you aggregate that data and put it together with other variables, and you can easily put vulnerable groups in.
But this is a problem related with the issue of anonymization and so on. That means that in theory, those data don't relate to anyone, but in practice, when you put them in connection, that brings you into some personal data. And there is a huge debate on whether anonymization is really possible or under what conditions. In general, we consider that data might be anonymous if you need to do a kind of huge effort to link them with an individual, because most probably total anonymization is very hard to gain. But I mean, usually we don't have to consider that anonymous data do not exist. That will not be functional, but indeed it might happen. Yes, that someone, takes a time and uses very sophisticated tools, and finally they manage to get some information about you. If it was not really linked to you at the beginning. Yes, that might happen.
Yeah.
But they are anonymizing those data, and so they will need a kind of legal basis to process those data, of course.
Yeah. So Camille, want to speak? Please go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon or good evening. My name is Camille. I'm from the Philippines, and I'm very excited to be part of this talk. It was very interesting and provided a lot of insight really on this issue of data protection. I did want to ask, well, we're in the Philippines, so I don't think the GDPR really applies, but there are a lot of principles that you discussed that definitely are relevant. And given the hot topic is the pandemic, what's the implication of processing sensitive data such as health-related data nowadays when you have things like contact tracing apps or patients like COVID-19 results and things like this? How do you think, this is an unprecedented challenge, so how do you think we'll be able to balance the need to protect data subjects' rights to their health data and the need of, for example, the national government to have access to this data so they can track like the number of active cases? Because like at least in my country, a lot of people don't want to be tested or don't want to reveal if they have symptoms, but this is actually like part of public interest in that. So how do you balance that out? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Very interesting. In general, as I was telling you, health data are special categories of data, especially sensitive. So in order to process this data, you should have a very good reason to end up with the ban. And as you were saying, public interest is and public health, it's an essential basis to do that. But what we usually don't have in mind is that we have always the data minimization principle, meaning that you should always keep in mind that you should only process those data that you really need to reach the aim you are looking for. Meaning that I will try to give you an example. If you can, we are now considering the digital or the travel pass or whatever, no? Anything like that. Imagine that, for example, in the future, you are able to access to a kind of space showing something that is telling that you are not dangerous for the rest of people. Well, and imagine that you can do this in two different ways. One is that you will show a kind of a certificate that you are vaccinated, or a certificate of that you have been negative to a test or anything like that. Okay, you can do this. But the alternative is that you can just, show a kind of QR to a machine, and there will be a green light or a red light, depending on whether you have done that. But the one that is in there will never know what is your option. Yeah, this is very simple. In terms of data protection, ideas and the data minimization principle, you should always opt for the second alternative, because it's reaching the same aim without providing, some kind of sensitive information that is not really needed for this kind of aim. So my answer will be always like, respect for personal data should not be a definite boundary to fight against pandemic or anything like that. But we should always keep an open eye and say that we should always use the alternative that allows you to keep the maximum, power and control over your data. So that should be more or less what I have in mind. It's not bad, but we should always try to be the most respectful that we can be, if we will reach the same aim, of course. So that's my answer, more or less.
Great, thank you so much.
Yep.
Thank you, Camille, for this question. Very interesting, and also because this will be a hot topic in the upcoming months, I guess. And we are starting to see something in Israel already.
Yep.
They're talking about opening some like swimming pools and shops only to vaccinated people. And
yep.
It will be interesting to see what happens. to report on that, of course.
Yep. So Federico, I think we got more or less what we were just having in mind.
A good amount of very interesting question and insights. I guess if there is someone else who wants to make one last quick question, we can leave a couple of minutes more. Otherwise I'll once again, I will point you to the handbook, to this working version that I shared in the chat, and also stay tuned for the next webinars that will take place in the upcoming months. So please go on Twitter and follow us on the Panelfit profile. I will put the link as well, so that you will be informed on everything we do. And also on panelfit.eu is our official website. So anything we do, we will publish there. So here it is. And great. Thank you very much, Iñigo.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your attention. Okay, see you next time.
See you next time.
Have a nice day. Thank you, Federico. Bye-bye.
Bye.